everyone. Thanks for joining the Working Group 1 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative. Oops, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the Working Group 1 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative. This one is related to supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation. This is Christina Osborne with ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. We have Mark Richardson, who is the facilitator, and Bob Cott is the scribe for this working group. And also Phil Pettengill will be joining us. Phil is the coordinator overseeing all three of the EDAM working groups. And we also have Danny Johnson, who is with the ISO's policy team, who's going to be presenting as well, and we'll go over that when we review the agenda. We are back to our regular meeting cadence after scaling back to one meeting per week for each of the work groups over the past couple of weeks. This work group meets on Mondays and Wednesdays from 3 p.m. and the participation details for the meetings are available on ISO's public calendar. So as I mentioned, we do have Danny Johnson who's with us. He's going to be discussing the treatment of imports for purposes of RSE, and then Mark Richardson will tee up the discussion on consequences for failing the RSE. And then we'll reserve time at the end for Bob Cott to provide a recap of the discussion. And then Mark's going to go over the topics for the next meeting, which is this coming Wednesday. As far as meeting reminders, we do encourage you to ask questions. If you have a comment or a question, that you raise your hand and a facilitator will call on you. And as a reminder to please introduce yourself first so the group knows who's speaking. We are recording the meeting and we'll post the video file out on the Working Group 1 webpage, where you'll find the other materials related to this working group. We did post this presentation that we're reviewing just right before the meeting, so it should be available shortly. And just as a reminder to please request permission from the ISO before reprinting any related meeting transcriptions. And then if you are interested in presenting at an upcoming working group meeting, again, you can send a request using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. And then we'll reach out to you to coordinate the logistics for that meeting. So at this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mark Richardson to review the objectives of today's meeting.
Thank you, Christina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Good afternoon, team. I appreciate everyone taking the time today to continue our efforts in this space. As a group, last week we covered the Sufficiency Evaluation Framework and reached what I believe to be a general agreement as a group on the optimized sufficiency portfolio approach that George from the ISO presented on. There were a few points that came out of that discussion, and these items were the on-demand advisory run needs to be timely, going back to that 5-minute SLA. The level of AS to consider in the optimization was yet to be known, and we heard from the group that there does need to be some level of AS, but not to further complicate the actual optimization run itself. And lastly, the level of transparency around the advisory RSC results, who to share those with and when. I believe the ISO has what it needs to put some more thought into this approach and put forth a comprehensive proposal that takes into account this group's comments. So I want to thank everyone for their time yesterday and really a good discussion on that approach. For today's discussion, I would like to primarily focus on the treatment of imports as it pertains to the resource efficiency accounting and potentially start the conversation on RSE failure consequences. I really am looking for stakeholders' thoughts and opinions on these topics, so please feel supported in speaking up. And I apologize in advance for calling individuals out, but I really am looking for parties to weigh in and provide their perspectives on these different topics. Let's go to the next slide, Christina. All right. Firm energy import considerations. The common design principles specifically called these out as a topic and item for consideration due to these agreements being utilized by various parties to meet their own IRP and forward procurement programs. One example of these arrangements for purposes of discussion today is the WSPP Schedule C arrangement. Please note there may be others, but the goal here is to find commonality in the framework of these arrangements to determine the appropriate accounting rules towards the RSC. So WSPP Schedule C. These arrangements may not know the source or transmission path in the EDAM time horizon. So, how do these get accounted for? What does this actually look like? So the goal in the next slide here is to tease out some of these details through the group. Next slide, please. So what I've done is I listed a few questions here to help start the discussion and to get parties to weigh in on these topics. So, questions to consider and for parties to weigh in on. What are or do these arrangements look like? Are there different variations of these arrangements? When is the source and transmission path known? Is the delivery point to the system static, or can that change? And then lastly, the level of certainty around these megawatts being delivered. I know historically, several parties have stated on this call that they utilize these arrangements, and they have been doing so for the past decade, and they're highly reliable. So with that, let me pause here and see if I have any parties willing to share what these arrangements may look like for them and to weigh in on some of these questions and comments I listed here. All right, I see Ryan from Portland. Chris, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Ryan's line.
Hey, Mark, this is Ryan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan. Good afternoon.
I don't know that I can weigh on every single one of those questions, but one thing I did want to highlight is maybe a discussion point, and others can kind of chime in, is that the timeline of scheduling and tagging the firm energy is going to be pretty critical for the EDAM resource sufficiency evaluation. So in general, my understanding is that most deals are in between 8 and 8:30 a.m., but scheduling and tagging can last until noon or even later. And then on a very hot day, when we need to purchase large volumes from counterparties, we're going to be leaning on others to give us that path. That said, the scheduling time is a bit out of our control, and the tagging and scheduling could last until 1500, which is the hard deadline that we would need to get all tags done.
Thank you, Ryan. So just to confirm, what I heard was the firm energy, so from a specific source, most parties, or at least your understanding is, that's usually known by 8:30, which would be prior to the EDAM closing. But, when it comes to actually scheduling or knowing the path, sometimes that's not locked up until 1500. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding.
Okay, perfect. And, for the path, so given the fact that you know the source, you know which BAA it's coming from, you just don't necessarily know which scheduling point that's going to come across?
Correct.
And last question, and I really appreciate you being willing to raise your hand here to get the conversation started, is in Portland's, history of dealing with these, would you say those are relatively reliable or have a high confidence in showing up in real time?
I'm not entirely sure. I guess it would depend on how you define high confidence, but I could get more information for you. I don't know offhand.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you chiming in first, Ryan. Let me go to Paul Wood from PAC.
Hey, Mark. Thanks. Yeah, it's Paul Wood from Pacificor. I've been doing this over 20 years, and we consider these firm. Obviously, they're firm, Schedule C, meaning that if somebody fails to deliver, there's a financial consequence to that delivery. But when we are short in our meeting obligations, this is how we resolve that short, is through the market, entering into bilateral transactions that are deemed, WSPP Schedule C. We buy and sell in the bilat market either on the ICE platform, through voice brokers, or through direct transactions. When we do these deals, we definitely know the point of delivery if we're buying. I know if I need to buy in the Northwest where I'm buying, and I know where I'm buying in the Southwest if I'm buying. And the same holds true if I'm selling. As to the source, when I'm buying and short, like Ryan said from Portland General, we may not know the source of the transaction anywhere from, 7 a.m. until, 3 o'clock is the latest. The vast majority of transactions that we enter into, we know the source and or sink by, usually 1 o'clock, sometimes, a couple hours earlier. Like I said before, the delivery point is firm or static. When we enter into these transactions, we know exactly where the delivery point is. And the certainty on these megawatts, we fully expect those megawatts to show up on real time or whenever we enter into these transactions, whether it's, day ahead or, many months in the future. The expectation, if they're WSTP Schedule C, they're going to be there.
No, I appreciate that, Paul. And just to say, you said something that kind of sparked a question. Are these day-to-day contracts, or are they, like you mentioned, a month out? Do you procure a WSTP Schedule C arrangement for the month, or are there various flavors of those?
So, however you're looking to resolve perhaps a short position. So when I'm looking to do transactions for, if we have a short for tomorrow that is a result of, maybe higher load because of, a change in weather, if we lose a generator, if the VERS are less than what we thought, then I'll do a day-ahead transaction. Okay. I'm also looking at doing either balance of the month or a forward contract that can be, 1 or 2 years into the future that are, these same products. They're WSPP Schedule C transactions.
Right. And so given it sounds like for most of these, the point of delivery, which tells me which BAA it's coming from. When you say you don't necessarily know the source, I think you mean a specific generator. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and that's a good point, Mark. I don't always know the BA that it's coming from, just because somebody could be wheeling something from,
okay. That's
BA
good to know.
or two away. But again, that obligation for where it's coming from, as well as the transmission that somebody's going to use to deliver my megawatts, they're on the hook to deliver those megawatts, and that's how I would resolve let's say I run an advisory RSE prior to 10 o'clock. If I see that I'm going to be short, to me, this is the primary mechanism someone would use to resolve that failure of the advisory RSE. You would go into the bilat market and procure transactions, however many megawatts you need, over what hour specifically your failure occurred, in order to resolve that short, so that you can pass the 10 o'clock RSE run.
Gotcha. So you would then you use the advisory RSE run to procure these additional megawatts in the bilateral market, and then prior to 1500, when the associated tagging timelines are due, by then the marketer would have reached out to you, letting you know the associated path and point of delivery, right?
Exactly.
Okay, perfect.
And sorry, Mark, but realistically, those paths are known well in advance of 3 o'clock.
By the marketer or by you as the buyer?
Me as the buyer.
Okay. So with that being said, then that path or point of delivery sounds relatively static for the day.
Yeah, for sure.
Or is that at a stack level?
No, the point of delivery is static.
Okay.
I know that the second I enter the bilateral transaction.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right, if I'm
perfect.
Yeah.
No, this is great. Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate that. You have any other thoughts or comments before I move on to Kevin Smith from Bank?
No, thank you.
No, that was great. I really appreciate it. Let's go to Kevin Smith.
Hey, Mark, Kevin Smith, Bank. Actually, Paul covered off on a lot of stuff and really helpful, Paul. Also, I know Bobby and some others have noticed the queue is starting to fill up. So I just, again, maybe pulling it up a little bit higher. You have the WSPP, which is an enabling agreement. And then you have various schedules under that WSPP. And in this case, firm energy, firm capacity is Schedule C. And then within that, it has specific, provisions. However, you have a confirmation, which is really where the guts of the Schedule C go in. And it's just a confirmation which will cover, myriad of things, the seller, purchaser, POD, what is the rate, delivery points. It could be multiple points. And so when we're talking about Schedule C, I think there's this idea that, it's so broad. And that's the thing. You can even modify or modify provisions in WSPP in your confirmation agreement. And right. So I've done a lot of these agreements over the years, and they run the gamut. And some of them, it's just completely. So to pin this down, but I think the essence of this discussion is really what I would focus on. And that is in my experience and with my clients over the years. And I can speak of, specifically one in particular, over, let's just say the 20 years or so I've been in contact, I can't think of a firm energy arrangement that was not delivered. And so the question is, we can start running down trails of when was it tagged, when does it need it. The bottom line to us is that, is it a reliable source? And I think Paul got to that point as well. And yes, we have not had issues with our WSPPs. We have them both that originate within CAISO, but, largely in the Pacific Northwest or even other areas delivered, wind and other things. So, but the bottom line is these are not curtailable for economic reasons, and they have proven to be a reliable and a necessary tool in our toolbox. And again, they range from day of to, I have done multi-year arrangements, like long-term arrangements under WSPP Schedule C. So, to try to kind of pin these down, I think the bottom line gets, are there any issues that we need to identify that certain parties may have take exception with? But otherwise, from our perspective, these are highly reliable arrangements and would be a necessary part of our portfolio in any EDAM as they are today. So,
no, thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
Yep.
I think what I'm walking away from that is, from both yours and Paul's, is these are an extremely reliable source, and you guys can't recall the last time one of these did not show up.
So I'm speaking from personal experience,
right?
And I'm speaking from my client's experience. I cannot say as a blanket, I'm not the, all-knowing WSPP,
right?
But I can tell you that if the contracts are properly drafted and the parties understand the importance of that this is a reliability, we don't like. There's a certain level of there is good utility practice. This gets into all kinds of issues of curtailing export transactions and other things that are just historically honored ways of doing business throughout the West in bilateral markets. I would expect that same good faith to continue as we continue to rely on these. It shouldn't change anything with respect to that.
I appreciate that, Kevin. Thank you. Let me go to Connie. And Connie, if you wouldn't mind letting the group know which group you represent.
My name is Connie Wiestat, and I'm with the Nevada Commission. I need to say that in Nevada, these sorts of agreements are the subject of an ongoing discussion as to their reliability, because in terms of the OAT, in order to be a network resources, which is the sort of resource you would need in order to reserve firm import capacity, the kind of transmission that the CAISO is talking about as being in bucket 1 transmission, you would need to know the upstream last transmission path available to that resource. And as you heard in these other discussions, these arrangements apparently are being made up into including the time the resource may be delivered, in which case that path was not firm, in which case that resource was not a network resource, in which case there was no reserved import capacity. So they're under scrutiny here, and I think there's a lot of suspicion as to their reliability.
I appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Ruben could weigh in here. He's been part and parcel of all those discussions.
Yeah, and Dave, if you wanted to raise your hand, I'd be happy to call on you. I'm going to see if Danny Johnson has any comments or thoughts on that from the ISO.
Yeah, that's interesting, Connie. Thanks for bringing that up. I would almost want to turn back to Paul and Kevin and see if they are having any of the same concerns within their BAA with regard to the issue Connie just brought up.
I see Kevin back in the queue. Let's go to Kevin. You have to unmute on your side, Kevin, it looks like.
Sorry about that. Yep, I'm double muting. Yeah, I want to hear from others on this one. No, we have not had that issue, and I do recognize that there have been, and you can start delving into issues of sources and how certain things may have transpired, particularly in August of 2020, where there were some issues, and we can't deny that there were issues. But without going down a whole different rabbit trail on those things, I don't doubt that there are people questioning the viability of certain arrangements, and maybe certain sources. But from our perspective, and we've been relying on these for decades, so I have no reason to be concerned. And I would also say that as we move into an RSE, there should be mechanisms there in DMM and other things to monitor the reliability, because we are saying that, these certain arrangements have to be relied upon, and if they prove to be a detriment to reliability or have habitually are not showing up, I mean, there's a problem. And so those will need to be monitored and identified. But from my perspective, we have no reason not to continue to have confidence in the contracts that we have entered into.
Thank you, Kevin. And I heard you say something, monitored. Were you saying monitored from the purchasing entity? In this example, when bank makes these arrangements, you guys are monitoring whether or not those are actually showing up and things like that? Or were you even potentially going as far as there may need to be a mechanism for monitoring overall in the EDAM construct?
Well, I honestly, I kind of spoke too broadly. I'm not sure about the latter. I mean, certainly we need to be policing, and it's in our interest to do that. But I would assume that any RSE is going to have some kind of corrective function within it, right? I mean, we haven't gotten into penalties and other things,
right?
But there will be oversight, and there will be, I would expect, reports by DMM and others and, potentially independent market monitors or others. But, these are all big policy issues that need to be discussed. But I would think a serial offender or an entity that's relying on a contract which isn't worth the paper it's printed on, there should be that I would have a problem with that, because it's going to affect all of our reliability. We're an interconnected system. And so there needs to be some accountability in that, and a recognition that, we shouldn't be coming to the party with a ruse. We should have, actual deliverable energy behind that agreement.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. Let me go to Bobby Olson, then I'll go back to Paul Wood, and then I would really like to see if David Rubin is willing to raise his hand and speak on behalf of NV, or kind of adding to what Connie stated. Bobby?
Right. Hey, Mark. Bobby Olson with SRP. And I do think that SMUD and Pacificor have kind of covered the broad aspects of Schedule C correctly. SRP, we consider them firm transactions. I can't attest to the same thing that I heard Kevin Smith attest to. I am aware that, in August of 2020 and other events, SRP has had purchases that were curtailed. We modify our own strategies to try and ensure that the purchases that we enter into for WSPP Schedule C are firm, and that includes kind of what I'll say is select engagement with counterparties to ensure that they have the ability to meet the intent of the firm deliverability aspect. There are entities that have historically transacted that really just look to the financial provisions. SRP tends to focus on counterparties that have physical assets or rights to physical assets. That way we have some assurance that they're doing transacting consistent with what the intent of Schedule C is. All of that being said is that when we've deployed those types of practices, we've found that the Schedule C can be highly reliable, very firm, and that's the way that SRP treats it when we enter into that transaction with somebody else and we're selling energy from our system. We have the intention of serving that to the point that we curtail our own load prior to actually curtailing the Schedule C arrangements that are firm in that particular case.
Okay, and
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bobby. From a firmness, I've heard you state firmness a few times. Is that known prior to, going back to kind of what Paul was articulating, around 8:30, or is that closer to that 1500 timeline in your experience?
Our experiences, we tend to see a little bit slower connections. I think the Pacific Northwest, they tend to be a little bit more timely. In the Southwest, I would say that we usually have a high degree of confidence of all the transaction information in terms of where it's getting sourced from and what transmission path, probably closer to noon or 1. That being said, we have plenty of counterparties that do identify it in that 8 to 9 timeline that was referenced earlier as well. It really depends upon the counterparty. It's like Paul referenced, we do know the delivery point at the time of the transaction, especially when we're purchasing and delivering it to our system. That's usually one of the most definitive things is the volume, the shape. Is it a 16-hour product, an 8-hour product, a 4-hour product, or some other custom agreed product? And then the counterparty that made the commitment. If it's a counterparty that is maybe a load responsible entity with resources, you have a little bit more certainty over where that's going to source earlier than you have final information on that, but that's not always the case.
Gotcha. And I heard, and I apologize to keep asking you questions, but this is all great information. I appreciate it. Are you seeing those sources sometimes coming from another BAA going back to it may will through to get to that point of delivery?
We do. We see frequently purchases that we might make in which things will wheel through. Obviously, as everyone's aware of, wheeling through the CAISO. We might see that wheeling through NV or the WAPA BAs in terms of how we interact with others, or we might even see it wheeling through APS's BA given SRP's position. Those that, and I'll say something that's probably a little controversial and hope not to upset too many people, but the area where SRP has had experience with those who do not meet some of the Schedule C firmness requirements are those that when we tend to see sourcing and everything finalized, it's sourcing from an area, say CAISO. CAISO exports are non-firm, but we do see entities that are willing to source and consider those exports firm. And so historically, that's where we've seen issues with the Schedule C firmness. If it's not firm, it's for entities who might choose to source from the CAISO on an export that is non-firm in that particular case. And so we're usually aware of that being the issue, and that's the only specific example that I can think of in which we've seen poor behavior with respect to Schedule C firmness.
Thank you. Appreciate your thoughts and comments there, Bobby. Really do. Let's go to Paul.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I agree with what Bobby was saying about those schedules. I just wanted to clarify that when we enter into those WSPP Schedule C transactions, I'm not suggesting that every one of them goes through delivery. The vast majority of those transactions do flow and there's no interruptions. Stuff happens on real time where we can be buying from somebody and they lose a generator and they're just unable to fulfill that obligation. What we would do during a time like that is we would go to the counterparty that sold to us and we would ask them, look, are you going to be able to resource that, or how do you propose you're going to fulfill that obligation you have to us? If they can, they'll go resource it. And if they can't, they would, say, look, I can't do it. Let's either book it out or just LD me. And, a couple folks have brought up, the issues surrounding, I think it was August 17th of 2020. When we're buying, and let's say I'm short for the summer in the Southwest, and I buy from an entity now for Q3, I'm not going to know where the source is. Every day that source could be somewhere different. And we did enter into transactions from counterparties who were sourcing out of California, and they were basically saying that was a Schedule C firm product. And when Cali did cut the exports, that counterparty was on the hook to make that delivery to us. In some cases, they couldn't, and so we had to turn around and LD them. Instances like that are infrequent, but it is a concern for, entities looking to transact in the summertime when there's a worry that, hey, some of this stuff could be coming out of Cali.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that, Paul. I see Kevin Smith with his hand up. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hey, thanks. And good clarifications, Bobby and Paul. So I want to just call out this California issue because I think that this is somewhere where folks, we need to, kind of settle and understand how things operate there. And this is where sourcing can be an issue. We've kind of gone through the school of hard knocks on exports from the CAISO, but this goes all the way back to the advent of MRTU, and SMUD happened to be, in a little closer proximity at that time than some of the other BAs. But there is a process in the CAISO, which we've all been talking about on export priority, which is how you confirm an export out of the CAISO, and it would not be subject to curtailment in excess of, it would be on same priority as internal demand. And that means that you would have a capacity arrangement for non-resource adequacy capacity in the CAISO. So it can't be committed to an LSE. So what happens is if you have non-source specific and you try to export and that marketer or whoever is sourcing out of the CAISO, now you've got a problem because under the tariff, there is no way to firm that transaction. There needs to be a non-RA resource to provide that scheduling and even curtailment priority. And so there's a process under the tariff, which we've all gone through on the forward scheduling discussions and so forth. So I think what Bobby has noted and others is true. And, you know, the other issue gets down to, you know, knowing your counterparty, you know, contracting with specific resources, having provisions for alternative resource supply in the event of, you know, because outages happen, things happen, you know, you're dealing with. So, you know, it's not a perfect system, but at the same time, you know, those types of things, there are, you know, system changes and operational topographical changes on transmission and so forth. But I do want to call out that issue because if we are talking about WSPP sourced in CAISO, the way you would source it in CAISO to have a firm export would, for an RSE, for example, you would need to have a specific supply arrangement with a specific entity that has surplus capacity in excess of its RA obligations to internal CAISO load serving entities. And that's when you can count on it. So I don't mean to imply that all WSPP Schedule Cs were firm coming out of CAISO because they needed to follow what, I think, were somewhat opaque rules at one point that have now been clarified a little bit.
No, I appreciate that, Kevin. And I saw Bobby's hand come up and come down a few times. And, you know, just thinking out loud here as the facilitator, you know, knowing the source from a double counting perspective, you know, obviously there's concerns around double counting of these and how to ensure you don't double count these. You know, does the host BAA or potential host BAA know about this arrangement so that they're accounting for that quote unquote export? You know, questions like that come to mind. Let me go to Bobby.
Sorry, Bobby Olson with SRP again. Apologies for that hand up and hand down. I was tracking where Kevin was going, and I do think his distinction was, or his clarification was important because when I did reference where we've seen challenges with the Schedule C firmness is when you're looking at kind of day ahead non-firm or day ahead non-source specific exports at the interties. And that's where we've seen issues with that. So I apologize that I wasn't quite as specific as I think maybe Kevin would have preferred I was to that, and appreciate his conversation and clarity there. In terms of how we might think about recognizing this, it's usually it's where the load or where the counterparty making the sale or committing to the transaction for the sale. I would expect that entity would likely be the one who's reflecting that in terms of their commitments and plan that submit that to the balancing area. So at least the balancing area would know that they've got that commitment as part of their total load. Candidly, where I struggle to map that out, it's easy for me to think about that when we think about, I'll say, the traditional utilities and load responsible entities. It's harder for me to think through how that works when you've got entities that are in multiple balancing areas or have resources in multiple balancing areas. So hopefully that's responsive to your lead in there, Mark.
No, I appreciate that, Bobby. Thank you. Kevin, did you have another comment or thought? I see your hand up. You may be double muted again, Kevin, if you meant to raise your hand.
Sorry. Yeah, I screwed up. I apologize. No, Bobby, what Bobby said, I wasn't actually even correcting. I mean, I'm just making a case in point that we have to address this source coming out of CAISO, and parties need to be aware of how that works. and Bobby's very well aware of it, and I wasn't actually trying to refine as much as just clarify that one point. And so, yeah, Bobby actually prompted me to make that distinction, so I appreciate that.
Perfect. Thank you. And I appreciate everyone chiming in here. This has been great. Are there any questions, comments, or thoughts? I don't know if we have any, quote unquote marketers on the phone that engage in these arrangements, and maybe you could speak to how you notify and the timing of that notification to the host BAA. If you wouldn't mind raising your hand, I could call on you if you wanted to chime in there. I think we have, I know in these next few slides, I've actually asked Danny Johnson to put together some examples. And, by no means is this a proposal. These examples are just kind of laid out and put together to kind of help spur that conversation. So Danny, feel free to take it from here, and I'll pause you naturally throughout your slides for questions and comments and to get stakeholder feedback. So thank you everyone for chiming in. I think that helps level set what these arrangements look like, and I'll turn it over to Danny Johnson at the ISO at this point.
Thanks, Mark. So I think Bobby's comment kind of provides a natural lead-in to these slides, and really it gets to the extent that we want to be able to account for these in the RFC, which I think we do. How would we practically model them in the market so the market would also actually be able to see this type of supply in the eventual EDAM optimization? So I think the first example we have is probably the most simple example. It would be a WSPP Schedule C sourced from a non-EDAM BAA coming into an EDAM BAA. I think from what we heard, the injection point into the EDAM BAA, that scheduling point, would be known by the BAA who is relying on that WSPP. I think we would look to model this as a self-scheduled injection, and then to the extent that any different injection point was needed and was revised following when we run the final binding RFC in the EDAM market, I think that the redispatch costs due to that injection point would be allocated to the EDAM BAA who changed that injection point, since it was ultimately their WSPP Schedule C. I think this is the most, again, simple example. Does this, I want to see if this makes sense to stakeholders about how we could model these. I do see a question.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. I appreciate you framing that up. Let's go to Tong from WAPA.
Yeah, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. I don't know the details. You probably, in the next few slides, you present a detail. But at this point, I think the injection point have to be specified, and depends on how you want that to be specified. For example, when WAPA imports power from Northwest, the delivery point is COB, California-Oregon border, not necessarily Captain Jack or Malin. So we check transmission, then we decide whether we would bring that in from Captain Jack or Malin. So if you say it has to be specified at COP level, that's going to be fine. But if you want to know specifically Captain Jack or Malin, maybe by 9 o'clock, it's most of the time is specified at that point, but it can change.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, Tom, you're saying that you might not know for certain where it's going to be, where it sinks into the WAPA BAA by 9?
Yeah, most of the time we know.
You have a general idea of the transmission path it's going to come through, but you don't know which of the delivery points that, I guess, could sync from that transmission path it would sync to?
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. WSPP only specifies its COP. It doesn't say it's Captain Jack or Malin. By 9, most of the time we know, which line is available. We have preferred path to bring it in, as long as there's no outage or something, we're going to use one or the other depending on the contract. But it can change. If there's consequences, I would like to see your next slides and see what consequences would be.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that I'm sorry, Mark, go on.
No, I was just going to ask you, and I apologize for hopping in here. Given that it sounds like Tong stated WAPA would know by 9 the exact point, to the extent a bid was submitted, let's just say 100 megawatts in this hypothetical example, at point A, and then at 9 a.m. they got confirmation that it was actually coming in on point B. I believe the entity would, just like today, would have the ability to remove a bid and resubmit the bid at point B. Am I missing something there?
Yeah, that would, that would be fine. If something happens, we want to switch it after 9, we can switch it, or even after 1, we may need to switch it. Then we'll just resubmit the bids in real time. But I don't know what the consequences would be.
Well,
is there any penalty or?
I think that's at least the way I understood it. But go ahead, Denny. I think that's where the IFM and the different points being settled in real time.
Yeah, I think that this example would allow for switching, Tong. What we would look for is an injection point that we can model for the purposes of running the actual day-ahead market. So to the extent that it does switch after the market's run, due to whatever reason, then I think the consequence would just be the redispatch due to the congestion charges from switching it.
Right, from energy point of view, not from RSE point of view.
Yeah, from an RSE point of view, I think to the point that maybe there's serial moving of WSPP injection points and it becomes a problem, maybe the community wants to limit that, but just from a pure running the market perspective, we would just need the injection point to be able to count it for the purpose of passing the RSE. And the purpose or the objective of the RSE is just ensuring that we have the supply to clear the day-ahead market. So it's part of that core function.
Yeah. So for example, if by 9 you run your final RSE, you know that say 100 megawatt comes in from one path, just say from Malin, and then we're fine. We pass it, we submit the bids at the Malin, and then after 9, something changed. So we decide to 50-50. And we passed RSE already. Going into energy market, it's a little bit different. And you still get the same megawatt, but the distribution is a little bit different. Another example is that after 10, all the bids are in, and then you run the market and everything is good. And later on, we find out there's some derates, so we need to make adjustments after the day-ahead market. But at that time, it's just resettlement of energy. It doesn't have anything to do with RSE anymore. That's my kind of thinking how this thing would work. But
yeah, I think we have alignment there, Tom. Yeah, I think we have alignment on that general concept. And the other thing I would note is we've previously tossed out the idea of like a bid range trading framework. This is one way I think on some of these schedules, especially some of the longer term ones that we just heard about, could be represented.
Okay.
Yeah, appreciate your comments there, Tong.
Sure.
Let me go to Kathleen from Vistra. Appreciate your patience, Kathleen. Go ahead.
Of course. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yep, loud and clear.
Oh, awesome. Okay. And interesting example. Appreciate a lot of what Tong was just saying. I just wanted to kind of chime in, maybe first in just high level from a market design element perspective first, and then I'll touch on it related to RSE. But from a high level perspective, as we've mentioned in one of some presentation, I think at the transmission working group, but We believe it's important that EDAM design include intertie transactions and intertie scheduling points. So if I'm reading this correctly as being able to implement that as an injection being modeled into the EDAM BAA is specified through submitting an intertie transaction at a intertie scheduling point included in the full network model, then you're getting me pretty close to being like, okay, cool, we're making progress in that direction. I think that is the right way to do it, and it's a lot of what kind of Tong was talking through. As long as the intertie offers can be submitted and they can, an entity can submit that in advance of the market by the market close, and they can remove that offer as long as it's done before market close, and submit the offer at the right scheduling point as long as it's in the full network model and they have the ability to submit the intertie transaction. And then afterwards, after day ahead market close, if something changes, they would need to buy back through, buying that intertie award back through the real-time market and submitting another intertie transaction at the appropriate scheduling point. And that way we'll maintain integrity across our settlements as well. So that'll be pretty important as another good example why we think that this functionality is necessary. As far as RSE, I think that we have taken the view that including imports that are, within the net import capability at that intertie scheduling point in the RSE is appropriate. I think what's really critical is that the failure consequences are sufficient enough to provide the disincentives of providing interties to pass RSE that are not expected to be there. And I think that we'll get into that more on the failure consequence. But conceptually, assuming we get to a strong enough failure consequence, then as long as these are interties at intertie scheduling points, I think it's fairly doable. That's just our viewpoint, and thanks for letting me.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I think in this example, it is a non-BAA, EDAM BAA. So I think there's another slide where it does talk about the EDAM to EDAM BAA and whether or not that's a intertie scheduling point or not. And then, I did hear from the earlier conversation when we were talking.
There, Mark, this is the example that I consider a true import, right? A non-EDAM BAA. Yep, cool, thanks.
No, thank you. And then earlier, I heard from everybody that, to the extent they're engaging in these arrangements, they are expecting them to be there, and Danny mentioned briefly, there may need to be a mechanism to, I don't want to say repeat offenders, but to the extent these transactions aren't showing up, there'll be associated reporting and things like that. So I just want to throw that out there. Danny, did you have any response to Kathleen, or would you like me to go to Robert?
Yeah, I just wanted one point of clarification, Kathleen. You're viewing this as just reflecting pre-agreed bilateral schedules in the EDAM, right?
Chris, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Kathleen Colbert's line, I'd appreciate it.
He did. Thank you, Chris. I heard you say, Danny, pre-agreed bilateral schedules. Without asking you to define what you mean by that, I think I would just say that what I'm putting on the table right now is a very high-level principle that deliveries from outside the EDAM BAA into the EDAM need to be reflected as intertie transactions at an intertie scheduling point. The actual process for procuring that energy behind that intertie, let's say import transaction, is not necessarily the focus of what I'm trying to clarify. I know you're providing WFTP source as an example, but there could be multiple different types of transactions and contracts backing that. The approach for enforcing it or modeling it in the model should be consistent regardless of what the contract is that's backing it. Now, I think there is a policy question of people are asking, should we exclude certain types of imports at intertie scheduling points that don't have a specific type of contract backing it. And I think in our view, the devil is in the detail of the failure consequence. If the penalties are sufficient enough to disincentivize backing imports that are being used to meet RSE, then, I think that maybe it can be a fairly general implementation. Imports, count, penalty, severe, if it doesn't follow through or if it's a repeat offender. If there's not an incentive structure to disincentivize that, and there's a risk of kind of more speculative imports being used to pass, then that is not a good durable market design. And then maybe other types of failure, and then maybe excluding them is now back on the table. But I just am reserving judgment until we understand what the failure consequences will be.
Thanks for clarifying that, Kathleen. And I do think you bring up an important point. Like, we do want any supply that's counted for purposes of passing the RSE to have an expectation of delivery and be reliable, because ultimately all BAAs who are participating are relying upon that supply coming into the market to clear the market for their own reliability. So I think that's a shared goal.
All right. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Kathleen. Let me go to Robert.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Luisa from WAPA. Hey, Mark, just want to point out, I don't know if it's mentioned earlier by Tom, but we follow the WECC pre-schedule calendar when we tag the imports for these transactions. And I heard about the 1500 hour being mentioned earlier, but those happen at the pre-scheduled day, not basically the day ahead of the CAISO. So just want to point that out.
Yep, understood. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
All right, let me go to Connie.
Maybe this is just demonstrates my ignorance, but I understand this example if I, from the standpoint of that EDAM BAA1 being the CAISO. But what I don't understand is if for example, that BAA1 were Nevada, how that injection from that non-BAA source would be a self-scheduled injection when that Nevada, but the NV Energy is still going to have an OAT, which doesn't have under its tariff these self-scheduled injections and IMFs and that sort of thing. Maybe that just demonstrates the fact that I'm completely lost, but is the idea with this whole network model that the OAT sorts of transactions would be going away?
Thanks, Connie. I don't really want to comment on what potential EDAM entity OAT revisions have to look like. I think there is acknowledgement that some OATs may have to be revised partially to accommodate the rules. With EDAM BAA1, that could be the CAISO, it could be any other participant EDAM BAA. So we're just trying to show how an injection into that BAA would be counted for purposes of passing the RSC, and then eventually having that injection point is important for being able to model that energy injection correctly when we try to clear the day-ahead market.
That would be massive changes to allow this. That's not to say that can't happen, but this sort of thing simply doesn't exist. I mean, we only have 2 times transmission network and point to point.
All right. Thank you, Connie. With what Danny laid out here, and again, this isn't necessarily a proposal, this is just to kind of help spur conversation, and I appreciate everyone weighing in. Does anybody not agree with the resettlement of energy being at a, whatever point that transaction ended up coming through? And if so, do you mind weighing your hand, or do you have any other thoughts or ideas around how to treat this? I see Kathleen popped up. Go ahead, Kathleen.
No, thanks, Mark. I appreciate the chance to just add something for us to think about. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I think that the resettlement of between IFM to real time it needs to be done at the same scheduling point because that's how we liquidate those positions. But that said, it is still a concern of mine if the practices are set up in a way that it incentivizes the equivalent of implicit virtual, where transactions are submitted in the day ahead, clear, are not tagged, are liquidated, or are bought back, they're liquidated, and it effectively functions as a virtual transaction at the intertie. As most folks know, we don't allow virtuals at intertie scheduling points, and I would expect the same type of rule to extend throughout EDAM, and it is a concern of mine and ours, Vistra's, that we just keep a close eye on whatever we propose, that there be, whether it's monitoring or something that is set up to make sure that we're tracking and addressing any kind of concerns that rules might be set up in a way that behavior starts happening in a way that we don't want to see it happen. So I just wanted to crowdsource that concern and ask for that to be on other folks' minds as well.
Thank you, Kathleen. I know, virtuals may be a topic in the coming weeks. So I appreciate your thoughts and comments on that. Danny, did you also want to weigh in?
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, Kathleen. That's something that we're aware of that we would want to ensure that this process couldn't be used as a means to have implicit virtual bidding at the ties. The other thing that I do want to point out, and on this simple example, get feedback from some of the potential EDAM BAAs, is this assumes that you know the source BAA that the WSPP is going to be coming from. I think that this is implied, right? Like everybody knows the delivery point. So in this case, you should at least know the source it's either coming from or being wheeled in. And is that a common understanding? Did I hear correctly the discussion we had earlier?
That's what I took from it. And I will encourage others to weigh their hands if that's not the case. I saw Carrie put her hand up first, so let me go to Carrie. And Carrie, I just want to start out, if this is regarding virtual bids, I do want to hold that topic and conversation for a later date, but go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Firm. I just wanted to clarify that Kathleen was talking about implicit virtual bids, which we do not want, not official virtual bids, which are a part of, a market, standard market design. So just your response and Danny's response confused me a little bit. I just wanted to make sure you understood her point and that we're not talking about virtual bidding. We're talking about implicit virtual bidding, which is effectively gaming.
Understood.
Okay. All right. Good. Thanks.
No, thank you for the clarification. Let me go to Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
Hey, Mark. Thanks. Yeah, it's Paul Wood with PacifiCorp. While I think I agree, 70% of the time that when we make a bilateral transaction that's WSPP Schedule C firm, we don't always know the BAA it's going to be sourced from.
The point of delivery though, right? I think I heard earlier that the delivery point is part of that main.
Yep, it totally
agreement.
It totally is. So, yeah, I definitely know that.
Right. So whether or not it's willed, so I think what Danny was saying, as long as you know the delivery point, it may be willed through that BA, but that host BA may know. And Danny, feel free to clarify.
Yeah, I think that's what I think that's what would make this example one work. I think there's an example a little bit later that's a bit more complex where I think we might need to revisit that source BA question.
Oh, okay. My apologies then. Yeah, then I would agree. We definitely know the POD.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Paul. Kevin?
Kevin Smith, thank. Well, maybe, I'm not sure now the question, what I was getting at is we generally know the source BA. What I want to just be clear on is that in the case of a WSPP without a specified source balancing authority or without knowing kind of where that is coming from, if it is backed by CAISO or it's coming out of that market, you have to, again, there's a procedure under the tariff to allow that to be considered a firm energy purchase. Otherwise, absent the idea of a source-specific supporting resource that is non-RA, there is no firm export, firm WSP. I don't care what you call it. It has to have those ingredients. So it's important that I think from generally speaking in the bilateral West that, a firm energy delivery, POD, good, for the most part. All right. But I would want to know that is it coming from CAISO? Because if it is, then I have to be able to take those procedures, and it's a completely different confirmation agreement. Absolutely entirely different than what would be a normal bilateral agreement.
No, thank you, Kevin. And, I think where Danny was going is the point of delivery for this example is key. And when we say point of delivery, that's where you're expecting the energy to come in at. Whereas the source BA, maybe for purposes of our conversation to avoid confusion, would be where the actual supply is coming from, whether that's, in this example, BAA 3 or BAA 2, that would be the associated source BA, whereas the POD is what's needed to be known for this example. Is that right, Danny?
Yeah, in this example, we would just need the POD to be able to model the injection.
Perfect. Okay, I'm glad I followed. Thank you. All right, maybe Danny, now's a good time to move to example 2, or okay, perfect.
Sure.
Let's go.
So this looks fairly similar to example 1. The idea here is just that point of delivery would be from a neighboring EDAM BAA. I think our expectation would be that to count this bucket 1 transmission to facilitate that transfer between EDAM BAA 1 and EDAM BAA 2 would be required to count that supply. I think the same redispatch and buying back the changing point of delivery between IFM and real time would still apply. The difference here again is that the bucket 1 transfer would be needed for counting purposes. And I think I misspoke earlier. This would be more of the bid range trading model, for example.
So the bid range, maybe I'm not following. When you say the bid range trading model, are you saying BAA2 would have a trade in place transferring some of that obligation to BAA1?
To the extent that it's being made by BAA 2, and they're the source and it's coming from their supply, I think it could be a bid range trade. I think to the extent that it's a third party embedded within that BAA, how that would be communicated to BAA 2 to enable it to be represented as a bid range trade would be an open question.
Gotcha. Thank you. Let me go to Paul Wood, and then I'm going to go to Kathleen. Go ahead, Paul.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Could you explain what you mean by a bid range trade? I'm not following.
Yeah, I think it would be an accounting mechanism. We talked about it earlier, but if in BAA 1 there's a 100 megawatt contract and it's coming from BAA 2, and they're both EDAM BAAs, and there's the 100 megawatts of bucket 1 transmission to facilitate that transfer, one BAA's requirement would just be adjusted by 100 megawatts, and the others would be adjusted by 100 megawatts in the other direction.
Hopefully that helped clarify, Paul. I didn't hear you respond. Let me go to Kathleen.
Thanks, Kathleen Colbert. Just a clarifying question. And I'm going to make your example more complicated. Can we add a EDAM BAA3 that EDAM BAA2 also has transfer capability to? Can we assume the transfer capability between BAA2 to BAA1 is 100 megawatts and to BAA2 to BAA3 is 100 megawatts? There are 100 megawatts of participating resources inside BAA2 that could support those transfers, and there's also 100 megawatt need within BAA2. And I'm making them all the same because my simple question is, does that mean in what you're suggesting that the 100 megawatts that the participating resources inside BAA2 would be used to count towards meeting BAA2's RFP and BAA1 and BAA3? So effectively counting for 300 megawatts worth of contributing to resource efficiency in the EDAM test?
I'm not sure I totally followed that example, Kathleen. I think we would only want to count the 100 megawatts for the BAA that it's being sunk into, and we would want to ensure for purposes of passing the RSC that to the extent that it was sourced from an EDAM BAA, that EDAM BAA would have sufficient capacity to support that transfer.
So to make it simpler, remove the third one. So there's 100 megawatts of RSC target for BAA2. It has the ability to transfer 100 megawatts out, and it has 100 megawatts of participating resources. Am I understanding you correctly that you would first identify the surplus megawatt and then reduce the transfer that could count? So instead of, in that case, there's 0 megawatts of surplus. So there would be no contribution from a transfer because it's already being used for the BAA2.
I see George Angelides, but I'm not quite following either. Let's see if George could weigh in. George? Chris, do you mind unmuting George's line?
So can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. George Angelides with the ESOM. So it's really a simple concept, the bucket one transfer, the way we discussed it. And it's been like 3-4 weeks ago, actually, very early on in this discussions. And we went through a spreadsheet example that showed exactly what happens when you have a bucket one transfer, both for energy and for imbalance reserves. Now, these questions are for imbalance reserve. So when you have a bucket one transfer between two BAAs in the EDAM footprint, essentially what happens is that in the RSC evaluation, we transfer imbalance reserve requirement from the sink BAA to the source BAA, all right? And this concept can be extended as much as you want for any pair of BAAs that have this bucket one transfer between them. So you can add another one here and have EDAM BAA3 or EDAM BAA4, that they can have individual bucket one transfers with others. Essentially what happens for every transfer, for every bucket one transfer, you transfer requirement. Let's say the transfer is for imbalance reserve up. So you transfer requirement, the imbalance reserve up requirement for what is the scheduling limit of that bucket one transfer from the sink BAA to the source BAA, and then you proceed performing the resource efficiency evaluation for that BAA. It's a simple extendable concept. Kathleen, you follow?
No, I follow what you're saying, George. Thank you. And I appreciate you jumping in and providing some extra content. I think that walking through some of these kind of simpler examples of how this would interact to ensure there's not double counting is going to be necessary to get through kind of thinking through if this is doable. So I would encourage you to mock up some more examples focused on the lens that I'm recommending. You have an example, but the lens that you're looking at it, George, isn't the lens of I think, the concern. And so I can work with you offline, and maybe we could kind of talk through that concern, and then that might help with some additional examples.
But what is the concern? Which is the transfer requirement from one BAA to the other? What's the concern?
Well, conceptually, I have a concern about if that's appropriate or not. What are we coming to the table with, and what are we trying to do here? I don't think is still really on the table. Like, we've jumped into the details rather than talk about if it's appropriate to transfer the requirements from a BAA to a BAA within the EDAM.
I'm not following what is appropriate or not. We're putting in place this bucket one transfer concept to facilitate contracts between BAAs or between entities within these BAAs to transfer requirements for imbalance reserve. Essentially, one BAA has a surplus of imbalance reserve, and they want to trade it to another BAA. This is the way that they can do it with this construct. And essentially, after transferring requirements, the selling BAA assumes the responsibility of meeting some of the requirements of the recipient BAA for the service, and then this is reflected in the RSC. What is appropriate or not appropriate, I'm not following. It's a simple construct. It's a trade.
And maybe I can get other, some BAA entities to weigh in here as well, to see if they're following this concept and if it makes sense. I've seen Michelle Quito's hand up for quite a while, so let me go to Michelle.
Hey, this is Michelle Quito from the CPUC. I thought I understood the bucket one transfers, but maybe I could ask it this way. So let's say that California only has RA resources. Who would be doing bucket one transfers out of California? I mean, the way I see it, there would be no bucket one transfers out of California because those resources are fully committed for the time being. And if they're not, is it CAISO that would be selling those? I'm confused.
Michelle, just for clarification, are you saying selling non-RA capacity, selling RA, like I'm trying to follow?
Well, there is, I mean, sort of in the operational space, there is no non-RA and RA. So I'm just saying that, are you guys going to be doing bucket one transfers out of California, or is that just a no-go? I understand a BAA that is fully integrated, and they sort of look ahead and they say, well, I've got these resources, I've got a 12% reserve margin on them. Above that, I could support some bucket one transfers. But, I mean, do you imagine California is going to say, okay, our RA fleet is 40,000, the load forecast is 35,000, put on the imbalance, it's 37, I've got 3,000 megawatts. Are you selling that on behalf of California customers? And then, I'm confused. Can you have bucket one transfers out of California?
Yeah, I don't think that we are looking to sell that access before we run the day-ahead market, since we simply would have no other mechanism to sell that. I imagine the bucket one transfers eventually could be reflected through whatever the either current or eventual rules of the transmission scheduling priority initiative is that the ISO has going on. I think those would probably be what eventually gets reflected as a bucket one transfer out of the ISO.
Okay, so then with regard to, so I guess what you're saying is the bucket one transfers would happen as part of the day ahead process potentially. And then that brings up a point I had raised earlier. So what if you have, intertie schedules into CAISO from a non-BAA? Let's say they bring in 1,000, and then let's say as a result of that, you schedule out of California through the day ahead process a transfer. And we've talked about transfers being firm, but what if the import doesn't show up in real time? Is California then on the hook for those exports that they've made to a EDAM BAA?
If I follow correctly, is this a similar flavor to the
Yes, it's always my flavor.
That we see in the EIM?
Yep. Yes.
EIM RSC?
Yes.
I think that this gets into intertie bidding, and I think that's something that we're not, is something that we would like to defer the discussion of right now.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I do see George's hand pop up pretty quick there. George, did you have a comment or thought? Not to get too deep on intertie bidding.
Yeah, it's not on intertie bidding. I'm just going to speak about transfers because, I think what we're trying to do, it was one of the fundamental asks in the EDAM design to provide the functionality for BAAs in the market footprint to be able to trade energy and capacity products. And this is what the bucket one transfer was made to do. Now, specifically about California transfers and the, bucket one transfers, it's like we're talking about a fundamental design element of EDAM. Now, specifically for California, we're going to talk about non-array capacity. It doesn't have a requirement to serve load in California. If an LSC or whatever participant that owns a generator has a surplus of capacity that may not be needed one particular hour to serve California load, I think this bucket one transfer would provide the ability to sign a contract with another BAA and sell capacity for that purpose. I mean, that was the whole idea of this bucket one transfer, and it's essentially reserves transmission capacity on the intertie for the potential delivery of energy in real time if that capacity is called on, like this we're talking about in balance reserve, in HUSK, you may call it, or if the uncertainty materializes, then the transmission capacity for it is available, and then you can call it on. Now, of course, we're talking all this in the context of resource efficiency evaluation. As we said several times here, after the resource efficiency evaluation completes and we go into the market, that transmission capacity under the bucket one transfer becomes available to the market to optimize. So at that point, it can be used for any product that is optimizable. So not only for imbalance reserve, maybe it will be used for energy if it's more economic to use it for energy. And then at the end of the market, you will have a day-ahead transfer for energy or a day-ahead transfer for imbalance reserve, depending what the outcome, the economic outcome is. So I'm just trying to clarify these concepts because I think we're a little bit not clear on them. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I appreciate that. I have seen Kevin Smith and Connie's hand come up, but in the interest of time, let's go to maybe Daniel, I'll ask you to tee up example 3. We'll take after you walk through, we'll then open back up the line for questions and comments. And then I'll first turn to Kevin. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. So I think this would be the more complicated example, which might require the WSPP Schedule C contracts to at least have a specified BAA that the energy is eventually going to be sourced from. In this example, the source would be from a non-EDAM BAA, but its eventual sink would be an EDAM BAA that doesn't have a direct connection with that source BAA, so it would have to be injected into a neighboring EDAM BAA and then eventually represented as a bucket one transfer into the BAA where the BAA who is utilizing that WSPP Schedule C contract. So I think this one is quite a bit more complicated because this now requires a level of coordination with the EDAM BAA that it's getting injected to, which is not the eventual source.
All right. Are there any questions, comments, thoughts, or reactions? I did hear in the earlier discussion that some of these WSPP Schedule Cs were actually willing through to get to the POD, and I believe that's what this looks like to me. So I'd be interested to hear thoughts, comments, and reactions to this. Kevin, Connie, to the extent you still have a comment, please raise your hand. I don't know if your hand was up by accident or maybe your answer was already provided. I see Connie just pop up. Go ahead, Connie.
If a WSPP agreement were being designed to transfer through a BAA to another, I don't think there's any way anyone would know that because at least under an OAT, they only have to disclose the last leg of that transmission. So you wouldn't know if any of that transmission they were relying on to get through were firm or not. And this sort of goes back to my initial question, and I think probably not the subject of this today, but the seams issue between that EDAM BAA and that non-EDAM BAA is of concern to me, because presumably that wouldn't be part of these buckets of transmission. That would still be traditional OAT transmission to and through. Do you think? And I guess I should have put a question mark at the end of that. Am I correct on that?
Danny, did you have?
I just wanted to kind of ask a follow-up, Connie. Are you saying that only the last leg of the transmission is known, or is the entire transmission profile eventually known where the energy is sourced from? I'd imagine it eventually has to be known for real-time purposes, right?
I do not think so. At least under an OAT, if it's a network resource, which means it is being relied upon to actually serve a load, and then necessarily needs to be as firm as possible, it only has to disclose the last leg. That's what the FERC has said. In order to be a network resource, that's the only piece of transmission they have to disclose, which means that all of the rest of that transmission can be non-firm.
Thank you, Connie. Kathy, did you want to weigh in on Connie's comment?
Yeah, Kathy Anderson, Idaho Power. So yeah, with regards to Connie's comment, it kind of depends on where's the title change at. So I suspect with Nevada contracts, and I don't know Nevada system, but if they're taking their load serving entities are taking title change and they're requiring their sellers to deliver it to their Nevada border, then she's correct. FERC is not requiring under a purchase power agreement to know for the transmission provider to verify that the transmission above there is firm. But for instance, Idaho Power, let's just say we go and make a mid-C purchase, and we're saying, hey, we're going to take that power and title of that power at mid-C. Then we are required for load serving and in our BA to go and get that firm transmission from the mid-C market to the point of our border that we want to bring it in. And so in that case, we would know the transmission arrangements. However, we may not know the actual physical resource that's sourcing that mid-C transaction or the transmission that gets to there. So it does get a little bit convoluted. For Idaho Power, we would know, we eventually would know the entire transmission path because it's got to get tagged to get into the system, but it doesn't have to contractually be shown up in order to classify that as a designated resource or something that would be used for a resource sufficiency test. We only have to have that transmission firm verified from the point where we take title. So I think that might be a distinction that is there.
No, I appreciate that. And just for my understanding, and maybe everyone else, the point in which you take title can differ from point of delivery.
It could be. We could take title at, well, sort of, right? I mean, if we tell the counterparty we're going to take title at mid-C, their point of delivery to me as the purchaser is at mid-C, but the point of delivery to my system might be La Grande. So I've got to wheel it through Bonneville's system or someone else's system to get it there. And if that's the case, I got to wheel it firm. I could tell them, hey, I want you to deliver it to me at La Grande. And at that point in time, what transmission they use to get it to La Grande, I don't verify in order to grant them network transmission. So it really depends on contractually where I'm taking that point of receipt of the energy as well as the point of receipt of my system.
Gotcha. Thank you, Kathy. Danny, any comments, questions, thoughts?
Kathy, following up on kind of what you just said on this example, would then the point of receipt then would need to be when it injects into the EDAM itself, because then whoever is utilizing that WSCP would at least know where it's injecting into the EDAM, and then it would be able to be modeled.
Sorry, say that one more time.
I think what you're saying is that you would know the transmission everywhere downstream from the point of receipt where the energy changed title, right? So applying it to this example, if the point of receipt was at the EDAM boundary, then the entity who's ultimately using the WSPP would know where it's injecting into the EDAM and would be able to represent that, and we could account for it in both the RSC and eventually in the model itself.
Yeah, assuming that the title change is as you say. Yeah, I know the path from the title change on. So.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other comments, thoughts on this example? Is this making sense? Do individuals agree with this approach? I see Bobby Olson with his hand up. Thank you, Bobby. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's one point that may be worth noting here, and that is EDAM balancing area 2, as shown here, may not have the type of visibility you might otherwise expect of this wheel through in this particular case. So as you guys are thinking through what it looks like, if it's what you have is effectively a transaction between BA1 and BA3, and it wheels through BA2. BA1 is where the transaction and pathway BA3 will be working to kind of source it through, but BA2 will only see that as just scheduled transmission rights and flow that works through it. And so I'm just trying to think about where you guys might be going with this and think that that might be a relevant point to make sure you guys are aware of.
No, thank you,
yeah,
Bobby.
I think, Bobby, you're cutting at the core of the issue is how with this design does BA1 work with BA2, and BA2 knows that the power is going to be injected to them and is able to be aware of it to be represented eventually in the RSC.
Yeah,
and Bobby, are you?
Go ahead. I'm trying to correlate it in the sense of like how we see, like say EIM transfers today, where we might have a transfer that comes into BA2 and it sinks into BA2 instead of fully wheels through, and then BA2 serves that to BA1, and that's kind of the way it cascades through EIM, and so that's a different paradigm than what we've historically seen. Now I think the balancing area does have some visibility and awareness, but a lot of those tags and scheduling protocols can be more on an automated process. So unless they were specifically looking for those types of transactions, they may just automatically schedule and flow without kind of operator notification awareness for BA2. I'm not on the balancing area side, so I don't know that I'm the best to speak to that, but I'm trying to correlate what I'm seeing here, what our experience in EIM is, and really trying to get at what I think the real question is. I don't know that I know the answer, just raising it as a question.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Let me go to Tong.
I have a question along that line. Usually when you have wheeling through, you have the ISO would have some balancing constraint to make sure all the schedules in the wheel through are the same, maintain the same in the optimization. So you don't optimize individual segment independently. So at the end of the day, they're not balanced. So, but in this situation, you have multiple areas here. I don't know if you're going to enforce that constraint. Of course, that's probably not RSE issue, more of your market, EDAM market issue. From RSE point of view, maybe you could just look at these segments independently, these legs independently. For example, for BAA2, you would simply transfer some of the balancing requirements from BAA1 to BAA2, and then from BAA2 to BAA3, like what George was saying, transferring the requirements. in the transfer of the requirements goes in the opposite direction of the arrow that you have. You could consider these 3 BAAs independently in that RSE evaluation. But this is not a recommendation. I'm just saying, is that what you're thinking? Are you going to consider that these have to be the same because they're on the same tag, on the same chain of tags, chain of winning through schedules?
I think, Tong, if I'm following, what you're saying is how we think this would work, that it would cascade from the injection would go to BA2 and then it would cascade eventually down to BA1. So it's just working through the details of making sure that is implementable, because ultimately we want, however this is accounted for in the RSE, to work when we actually run the market.
Yeah. I was just, I wasn't sure that at 9 o'clock you have all the information of all these segments on the wheel, or you will be able to link them. If not, you may have to do them independently. Would there be any problems? I don't have solution. I'm just, having these questions in my mind. I'm bringing these up. Maybe somebody can help to clean this up or clarify what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I think I defer to George on how he thinks we may be able to validate these.
Yeah, and I see George just rose his hand. So go ahead, George.
Yes, Tom. This is George, by the way. You're on the right path here. It's as you said, that in the RSE, we're not calculating any schedules. We're doing the resource efficiency evaluation, and we take into account all the bids and schedules that are submitted for a given BAA and the bucket 1 transfers that are declared between EDAM BAAs. So, and this resource efficiency evaluation is essentially independent for each BAA. So there's no wheeling issue. We don't really see that or need to see that, join the import with an export on the other side, or in this case, an import at an intertie with a transfer at the other side. It's not relevant, right? We perform it for each BAA, as you said. In the market, all right, there is a wheeling construct that we have at the ISO today that we lock in imports and exports into a wheeling constraint that makes sure that the import is equal to the export as we optimize both of these independently. That constraint keeps them in sync. So if you have an import and an export at an intertie, yes, you can declare them and link them through this wheeling construct that we support, and we continue to support for EIM, and we will support for EDAM. Now with the transfer, if on the other side you have a transfer, the transfer depends what kind of transfer it is, right? If it is bucket 2 or bucket 3 and even bucket 1, in the market that could be determined, the schedule could be determined economically. So that's, the transfers are economic schedules. So normally you wouldn't link those unless it's a bucket 1 transfer under a specific transmission contract, like we discussed a few weeks ago. We said that you could have a transmission contract that has a contract path that goes through multiple BAAs. So if this WSPCC schedule here is shown in this example, it's a transmission contract that goes wheels through BAA2 to serve load in BAA1, then the contract owner could schedule the import into BAA2 at the system resource at that particular intertie, shown in red there, with the red oval, and link that with a contract. And then, let's say the EDAM entity for BAA2 would submit a bucket 1 transfer to EDAM BAA1, which would also link that with a contract, and it will self-schedule the ETSRs that define that bucket 1 transfer at the same megawatt with a self-schedule on the import from BAA3. And now in the market, okay, this is not RSC, in the market you have essentially your wheeling construct where you have an import tied to an export to TSR, tied to an import to TSR, and you can even have a load self-schedule into BAA1 under the same contract, and then all the parts are all linked together under the contract reference number, so that then the participant that has all the schedules or is financially responsible for the contract can receive its financial right, which is the congestion difference from that load in BAA1 all the way to that import in BAA2. So we do support wheeling. In this particular case, it makes sense if it's a contract that involves bucket one. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, George, yeah, answers, I think, most of my questions. I still have another question. Today, we don't have this situation because if we buy anything from Northwest, we simply schedule it at the Malin, let's say. That's it. All we know is power is delivered at a COP. We're going to bring it in using our own transmission at the Malin. That's it. We don't really care. Maybe we may not really know at the 9 o'clock, what are the other transmission segments, the supplier is going to use to deliver the power to COP. We don't need to know that. We just bring it in from COP to ISO. That's it. But when you have these many EIM entities, I don't know if you would need to know at 9 a.m. Maybe you still don't. I don't know. How do you intend to model this?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the market, you need to know where the energy is coming from. So if it is coming from a non-EDAM BAA, you need to declare a schedule at an intertie with an EDAM BAA. So here that will be the red oval. That's an intertie between EDAM BAA2 and non-EDAM BAA3. There will be a system resource registered in the master file for schedules, import schedules into BAA2 from BAA3. And the participant will be the scheduling coordinator for that resource, and they will submit a self-schedule import for whatever this contract is. And if it's associated with contracts, transmission contracts that they also have rights inside BAA2 and maybe over to some transmission over an intertie to BA1 and even to BA1 going to load, then you can associate it with the contract reference number and specify all the intermediate sub-schedules to link it. But we need to know where's the intertie where the energy is going to come through so that we can represent it in the market as an injection at the default generating aggregation point for BAA3, tagged at that, potentially tagged at that intertie that's shown with the red oval, so that we calculate a price for it. We need a location to calculate the price and settle it, right?
Okay.
So I hear the question. Yeah,
George, let me ask you another question. I kind of know what you're saying, but let me ask you another question. Let's say I make a purchase from somebody. Let's say I make a purchase from you. You're a power marketer. I just make a purchase from you. I say, you're going to deliver the power to COP. And
okay.
So, and then you said, okay. And so one day ahead, say at 8 o'clock, I call you. I say, hey, George, are you still okay delivering that power to me? We have a deal. You said, no problem. I'm going to deliver power to COP. I say, okay, can we bring it in from Malin? You said, okay, Malin it is. And then I'm going to schedule to the ISO. I say, I'm going to submit a schedule to the ISO at the Malin. Okay. And you, George, you're going to work out your delivery schedule with a whole bunch of BAs and make sure that you have the transmission and all that. At this point, I don't really need to know all of that. You may have it. If you give it to me, that's good. If you don't, that's fine. You have time to give all that to me later. So at this time, from WAPA's point, from my point of view, does the ISO need the whole path, knowing where the source is, which BA this power would be going through with which transmission, or you just know that I schedule at Malin, I submit injection at Malin, that's all you need to know. Would that satisfy the RSE requirement, or it doesn't?
Oh yeah, that would satisfy the RSC requirement, but let's give a little bit of context to this example. This assumes that BPA is not in EDAM yet. All right, so that's why the Malin is a scheduling point with the ISO. So SCs can bid that import at Malin. And then that's all we need to know for performing
the source may not be from BPA. The source could from Montana, Idaho, I don't know, maybe from British Hydro. I just don't know. A marketer, you're the marketer, you go and purchase, you're going to deliver power to Cobb.
Understood. And this is what the situation is today, right? When we see an at Malin, okay, we don't know where it's coming from. And today we are representing the injection at the bus of Malin 500. Okay, that is incorrect because there is no generation there, but that's how we do today. So in EDAM, we'll improve on it, and we'll assume that the energy is coming absent any information from somewhere in BPA territory. So we'll probably put the location of that injection, we'll distribute it at all the generators in BPA, that they form the default generation aggregation point. It's an incremental improvement in the accuracy that we need for performing congestion management and contingency analysis and all these things that require actual physical flow to be accurate for performing. If we have additional information that the source of the energy is actually not BPA, but it's BC Hydro, then we can do even better modeling and have better meaning more accurate results. But for the purpose of the resource sufficiency evaluation, this information is not necessary. It's sufficient to know that it's coming at Malin.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, George.
And yeah, thank you, George. I was going to hop in. I appreciate the back and forth tongue, but we only have 4 minutes, and I want to respect everyone's time. So let me go to Carrie, and then we'll turn it back over to Danny, see if he has any other further closing remarks. Again, I would encourage stakeholders to take a look at these slides, reach out to me to the extent you want to, continue discussing this, comment on them, and then we'll go from there in Wednesday's discussion. So Carrie, go for it.
Carrie Bentley, Western Power Trading Forum. That was great. I had so many of the same questions as Tom. So just following up really quick, George, I know you said it doesn't matter for the RS test, but it sounded like from the discussion with Connie and Kathy that those other paths could be non-firm. Are you saying then that the CAISO really only cares about that last firm bucket 1 transfer and any of the other transfers to the other BAs? They're not going to look at really even whether it's firm or non-firm, and that's just going to be ignored for the RS purposes?
Chris, would you mind unmuting George's line, please?
Oh, hi, Gary. This is George. Thank you for unmuting me. So let's clarify again, because I think we're going back and forth on this. This example did not have a bucket 1 transfer. It did not have a transfer. This was an import at Malin, because that's why I clarified the example saying that BPA is not an EDAM BAA in this example. The issue of the transfer comes in, if we modify this example, we say BPA is in EDAM. Now, this schedule should be declared as a bucket 1 transfer between BPA and ISO in this case. That's what Malin interface is. And it could be used for the resource efficiency evaluation of the ISO and of BPA. And we have said here many times, I think, that we expect that transfers are either firm or reasonably firm, or I don't remember exactly the words that Milos has used several times here. highly reliable transmission, essentially. And the market and the resource efficiency evaluation does not have transmission classifications. It only sees one type of transmission, and when it clears the market, it's considered firm. There are ways to model non-firm transmission, but we have to discuss this a little bit later here when we start discussing RAC. So I don't want to bring it into this discussion. So let's assume for the point for this point that everything that is declared in the market is considered firm as far as the transmission goes.
I guess maybe we're running out of time here. I'll just say I was concerned with the examples that Connie gave with the network resources where only the last leg was firm, and she used the term non-firm, and the remaining could be non-firm. So when I was looking at this, I was looking very basically at the purple circle being firm and the red circle being non-firm, and wondering how you'd handle that in the RRS test. So maybe just kind of more in plain English, we could get an answer on that one. Or, sorry, it's so simple.
In plain English, sometimes a schedule is considered non-firm because maybe a few hours in the year it cannot be materialized for whatever reason, and then therefore it cannot be firm, so it's non-firm. But again, if it's what we call reasonably reliable, that we can count on in the market, then it could be declared as a bucket one transfer. We will take into account in the RSC and in the market solution afterwards.
Okay, that sounds great. I think that just means we'll map, I guess, firmness to reasonably reliable at some point. But I get the general framework. Thanks, George.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Carrie, and thank you, George.
Carrie, the one thing I wanted to add on is I think that mapping has somewhat been implicitly done by the entities who utilize the WSPP Schedule Cs. Because I don't believe those contracts require, not uniformly at least, firm transmission all the way through. It's just a firm energy contract. So I think, again, those BAs who utilize these have already kind of done that, and we would just be looking to utilize that same understanding of reasonably reliable transmission that they have.
Thanks, Danny. That's really helpful for those, California folks. Maybe we could see it on a slide at some point, but that makes sense to me.
All right, so looking at the time, it's 2:56. Heather, I do want to give you an opportunity to pose a question or comment, and maybe for stakeholders to think about prior to Wednesday's call, but I am going to ask you to please keep it brief.
I'm always very brief. So, George, I don't think you can avoid checking the whole path like Tong is asking about. If you look on this picture, if you assume that EDAM BA3 is, and you are selling from BA3 to BA1, you have to have firm all the way, and you have to map to each BA, to ETSRs, and make sure that everybody has firm that is not above ETSR limit. So you have to have that mapping derived out of the path from point of receipt to point of delivery on each inter-BA intertie or ETSR. And call it firm or reasonably firm, whatever, but you need to follow up on the path and split it individual RCs for BAs.
Thank you, Peter. George, did you want to? Oh, I see his hand up. Go ahead, George, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob Cott for a summary of today's discussion.
Yeah, Peter, this is George. What I said was that if this is a contract, the transmission contract, and the contract path is defined all the way from that import into BA2 through a bucket one transfer into BA1 through some load in BA1, yes, of course. All of this is going to be defined.
Don't mix it with transmission contract. You will confuse people. This has to be doable even without transmission contract in master file. It has to be on the fly before 9 a.m. They just enter into e-tagging system. You should be able to dismantle that and assign to BAS. Okay, we don't need to do that, Peter. All we need for the resource efficiency evaluation, if it's not a transmission contract, is individually for each BAA, what are the imports and the transfers under bucket one. So for EDAM BAA2, all we need to know is that there is an import at that intertie with the red oval
from BAA3 for that self-schedule, and then a bucket 1 transfer between EDAM BAA2 and EDAM BAA1 at that intertie with the, purple oval for X amount of megawatts as the scheduling limit for it. And that's all we need to perform the RSC for BA1 and BA2. We don't need to link those.
If BA3 is EDAM and it's willing to BA2, you still need bucket 1 between BA3 and BA2, even it's willing to BA2.
Yes, if BA3 is in EDAM, then we need 2 bucket 1 transfers here, all right? But they don't need to be linked for RSC because the RSC is performed independently for BA2, BA3, and BA1. So all we need to know is this.
You need as part of our RSC evaluation to check the ETSRs are not violated in bucket 1.
Hey, Petter, George, I'm sorry. I'm gonna hop in and maybe we'll continue this conversation on Wednesday. And maybe that's a good starting point. I don't mean to cut you both off, but I do want to respect everybody's time as the facilitator. And Bob, if you wouldn't mind quickly giving us a debrief of today's conversation. And then folks, I encourage you to take a look at the slides. There was a slide where I teed up a few questions around consequences of failure, and it looks like we will be continuing. We'll start off with this slide on Wednesday. Petter, I'll ask you to raise your hand, and we'll get back into this discussion. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, so I think we spent the bulk or the entire time talking about the WSPP Schedule C arrangements, and there was some general understanding that the capacity was usually secured by around 8 to 8:30 in the morning. Scheduling and tagging seems to range from maybe 12 to 1,500. There seems to be a general belief that the products are reliable to the extent the contracts have been completed with due diligence. There's a discussion about monitoring to ensure performance as expected. There's a concern expressed with regard to reliability without knowledge of the transmission path. And then the exports from California required a different confirmation process. And that the transmission path is known from the point of the title transfer. Danny discussed the 3 examples, and then there was a lot of discussion about the details of those transfers, which I expect will continue on Wednesday. And I'll hand it back to you, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. And I apologize for going over, team. Great discussion, great dialogue. I really do appreciate everyone's engagement, and we'll definitely dive into some more of the details on Wednesday. Again, I encourage you to take a look at the slide deck, get a sense for the examples that were laid out, come prepared with any questions you may have. And Petter, George, I look forward to the discussion on Wednesday. Thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.